In Module B, we're going to start looking at how we can measure memory. And I thought this graphic was interesting. It's not something that you need to worry about just yet. We will be talking about the brain and memory a little bit later, but just the idea that we use a lot of our brain to help us remember. Different parts of our brain are crucial for different kinds of memory. So for instance, the amygdala is mostly tied to emotional memories, but more about this a little bit later. For now, this is a very short module. What you need to know is how we measure memory, what's the difference in the different ways we can see if a person's remembered something or understand why they may have forgotten something. Okay, so let's start with recall, recognition, and relearning. Recall is something that you do all the time. There's no cues available, you don't have a picture in front of you, you don't have any kinds of information, but you remember based on your experiences or the fact that you see it as important enough to remember. So for instance, I don't know if in any of your courses you have an essay question. In the essay type question, you're asked a concept and you're asked to respond or expand on that concept with as much detail as you possibly can. There's no cues there, except for maybe there might be a cue in the question, but the idea is that you take a bit of time to reflect on what you learned about that particular item, and then you write what you can to show how much of it you have recalled in the testing situation. The second one that I want to talk about is recognition. Recognition is easier because you have some kind of cue. In my last module, I showed you pictures that could have been taken from a family vacation or what have you that showed a start of a memory. So for instance, we look at a picture of Uncle George and cousin Bob together, and we remember the last time we spent time with them at the cottage or at somebody's wedding or whatever the case may be. So we can look at that picture and say, oh yeah, that's what happened at that day. That's when we went on that fishing trip or at the cottage or whatever the case may be. If we go back to the testing example from my first point, multiple choice is a really good example. The answer is right there. It's A, B, C, or D. And all you have to do is sort of recognize what seems like the best possible answer to the question that you're given. And I know some people find multiple choice questions difficult because there are several questions, or several answers rather, that look like they could fit. But I think the thing to remember is try and get the one that's the best fit. Even if something looks, like a really good fit, if you can sort of say to yourself, well, this is a good fit, but this one's better, so I'm going to choose this. And that requires reading each one of the options carefully. Just a little help with multiple choice tests for those of you who find them a little bit more challenging. The third one, relearning. This is being tested in lots of different ways, but what relearning does is say, okay, you learned something a long time ago. You haven't really used it. Have you forgotten it? Do you remember how to do it? Can you recall it again? And one of the ways that this was tested was through an experiment done by Bert. And what he did was he looked at different children who had been told stories in Greek at a young age. Now, these children weren't from Greece. They just happened to be told these stories. So they would pick up those words, sort of, but if they're not speaking Greek on a regular basis, obviously they're not going to remember it. But then he reintroduced those Greek stories when they were 5 and 6 years older, and found that those children who had been exposed to the Greek stories once before had an easier time remembering it. In fact, 25% more of them remembered it than those who had never been exposed to the Greek stories. So it's a way of sort of understanding how we can recall something that we've been exposed to in the past and take less time to relearn it or to reconnect it in our vocabulary, our repertoire of what we understand and what we know. Another theory that is related to how much we will remember is depending on how deeply we take that information and use it in some way. So the example I'm using here is if you just looked at my headings and didn't really bother, and you just said, okay, they're all capital letters, does that mean anything? No, you want to know more about the words, the actual words. What do those words mean? How does it fit with what's the context that I am talking about and that is written on the rest of the slide? So the structural part, is it capital letters, is it small letters, doesn't really matter so much. It's very shallow learning. But if you want to get better with it, you might want to sort of think of a way that you can sound it out, rhyme it with something else. But the best way to learn and retain something is to use it in a sentence. This is something that you probably heard in your literature classes or in your communications classes, where you learn a new word in class and you find a way to put it into a sentence. Why do we remember it more than if we just, rhyme it with something else? We remember it more because we remember how we put that sentence together. And it might be a silly sentence, it might be a sentence that has relevance to you, but the fact of the matter is you have incorporated it in some way into your vocabulary, and so you're more likely to be able to recall it if you had to come up with a list of new words you learned this week. The other thing that we do sometimes, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next module, but we remember things by piecing together a few highlights. So in other words, when we say memory is a reconstruction, we're basically saying that we don't remember all of the details exactly as they appear. We piece together the things that are important and relevant to us. So in other words, let's say you went to a party and you were having an awesome time talking to a few people, and you want to talk about it to your friend the next day and say, boy, you missed a great party last night. So-and-so was there and we were talking about this and we were talking about that, and you'd sort of put some highlights together. You wouldn't necessarily be able to sit there and say in detail that, let's say 2 weeks later you went to somebody, talked to somebody about it, the party. You wouldn't be able to say in detail that, she was wearing this and she was wearing that, and he was drinking this and he ate that, or whatever the case may be. That's not as important, probably not as relevant, and so you wouldn't necessarily have remembered it in as much depth, especially when we're talking about, a little bit later. The other thing that we sometimes do is we try to get a schema or try and put together something that helps us to remember how we should do something. And this is really useful for situations where we are using that again in the future. Let me give you an example. Supposing your friend says, let's go for dinner somewhere, and you're only used to going to McDonald's or any place where you have to go and order your food and then sit down at the table. But your friend is saying, oh, let's go somewhere really nice where we can sit down and get table service and order. But you don't know what to do there because you've never done it before. Now, obviously, most of us have gone to both kinds of restaurants at one time or another in our life with our parents or what have you. But the idea is that we would store those two schemas separately in our long-term memory. Because the schema for going to McDonald's is that you go and you look at the board and you decide what you want and you order from the cashier and they make up your food and you wait and then you sit down and eat. Whereas the schema for going to a place like Kelsey's is that you sit down or you get seated in a particular booth and you are given a menu, you look at the menu, the waitress comes and you order from the menu and your food is served when it's ready. So you see that both situations are very different in terms of how we would organize ourselves or handle ourselves, if you will. And so you have to rely on the different schemas. And this example is a pretty simple one. Like I said, most of us have gone to both types of restaurants at one time or another in our life, but the idea is that we keep this framework of how you handle yourself in particular situations stored in our long-term memory. Okay, so that's the end of Module 2. Like I said, it was quite a short one, but we will look at Module 3 on the nature of remembering, and we'll talk about a little bit about the brain and other parts of our memory systems a little bit later.